Live to the Deputy Labor Leader, the Shadow Defence Minister, Richard Marles. Now, Richard Marles, thanks so much for your time. Very interesting diplomacy from Chinese authorities in Australia over the last 24 hours. We're seeing the embassy pushing back really strongly at some of the language around the investigation, calls for that. In Melbourne today, we saw the consul in Melbourne alongside the Health Minister supporting the acquisition of 10 million coronavirus tests. What do you make of that?
Well, certainly the consul assisting in and speaking with the government around the acquisition of that equipment is a good step forward. It's also, to state the obvious, to have this kind of exchange between China and Australia right now feels less than ideal. I mean, it is important to have ultimately an inquiry, and one that is transparent in relation to the origins of the coronavirus. And that's not so much, in my mind, about applying blame. There'll be plenty of time for that, but it is about a search for understanding as to what has happened here from the point of view of China, but also from the point of view of the world. But I think what we really need to see in relation to this latest exchange is a reduction in the heat around it.
Well, so you agree with Twiggy Forrest that things and that people should simmer down?
Well, there's a lot to be focused on in Australia right now. The question of the social distancing that's in place, what the pathway out of that looks like, how the government's relief package is operating, those people who are missing out, but also how long it's going to stay in place and exactly how it will be withdrawn. I mean, it's not as though we aren't faced with a huge menu of issues in Australia right now in terms of guiding our way through the coronavirus crisis, and it seems to me that that should be the focus of government.
So in terms of the investigation as well, Andrew Forrest said to me, and you heard in that comment, he wants a timeline of beyond the US election, that countries in our region as well are just entering the phase of infections. We thankfully look like we've got on top of it for now, but others don't have that luxury.
Well, that's right. Look, I think it is fair enough to be talking about an inquiry which gives us a sense of understanding about what the origins of the coronavirus are, because that will, I think, also help work our way through this from a global point of view. I'd like to understand what diplomatic work the government has undertaken with other countries around the world to make an inquiry of this kind a legitimate possibility. And we haven't heard from the government really about what diplomatic efforts they've engaged in globally around getting an independent inquiry off the ground. I think it would have been better to have got a sense of that before the government was, announcing this push. But to be fair, we do need to get that kind of understanding. But we also need to be pretty focused right here in Australia now about what's going on, about how we walk down the path of easing restrictions and over what time frame that occurs. And it seems to me that's where the focus of government activity should be. And obviously the exchange that we've seen in the last 24 hours is between Australia and China is less than ideal.
But when you say that we haven't got enough information on what the government's done diplomatically, the Prime Minister has released information that he's spoken to world leaders on coronavirus and the very issue that we're talking about.
It's not clear to me what effort the government has undertaken around the specifics of the proposal that they're putting forward in relation to an independent inquiry. Certainly that wasn't part of the announcement, if you like, that the government made in relation to this. So if this is a serious proposition, then I just think it's important that the government is making clear to the Australian people who they've got on board in terms of pursuing this, in terms of other countries around the world. But I also just think surely the focus right now is here in Australia and the issues that we are facing and how we guide our country through this crisis and on the other side of it.
The Shadow Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, spoke in an opinion piece this week about the need for a reset, not disengagement with China. How does that work?
Well, we've got to be clear that we are going to be engaging with China for a long time to come. If anyone is walking along under the illusion that we can disengage with China that is pure fantasy. And so it's a relationship that needs to be taken very seriously, and a relationship where we would want Australia to be taken as seriously as possible by Beijing. That's ultimately the currency which gives us the levers to navigate what is a very complex relationship. And so it's resetting in a way which enables us to build our weight, if you like, in terms of how Beijing sees our country, so that we can navigate these issues, bearing in mind that engagement with China is clearly going to be a necessary part of how we move forward.
When you look at some of the, more broadly now, you've been talking about the challenges we face with the coronavirus. The curve has been squashed, at least in the short term. That must be encouraging for you as you watch this. And I know we've spoken over recent weeks about this pandemic, but what we've seen, the results have been incredible. So the Prime Minister is now talking about relaxing some of the restrictions. How soon should we start seeing that, Richard Marles?
Yeah, look, it's a fair question, and it's a good question, and you're right that the curve is very encouraging, and the small number of cases that we're now seeing appear based on the social distancing that's been put in place, and the way in which the border has effectively been closed to people coming into Australia is obviously a very good thing. You know, we were arguing very strongly that those measures needed to be done sooner rather than later, and precisely so that we could get to this point and minimise the size of the problem that the country was facing. I think as we now look forward and think about how we navigate our way out of this, it's important that we are thinking about the economy in the way that the Prime Minister described it today, but we need to be thinking about that not just over the coming weeks, but actually over the coming months and the coming years. In that sense, whatever steps we take have to have that kind of time frame in mind, because we clearly don't want to be easing restrictions again. This is a process we only want to do once, and to move too early, for example, and give rise to a situation where there was another outbreak, which meant that we had to move into some social distancing situation again, is obviously the last thing that we would want.